And welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray.
Hello, Keith. How are you this morning?
I'm good. I'm good. Uh, let's just. This is this is like our third week in a row, or something like that, isn't it? So
Yeah, I know it. We're on a run here, aren't we?
yeah, yeah. So go ahead and let's just jump right in and introduce our guests, Ray.
We've got Rhonda Bogard with us. Ronnie, as we know her, good friend of ours, and she and I worked at Y12 for a number of years. But what we have her on today for is the Alvin Weinberg Papers, and I'll tell you just a little about how this came to be, and then of course she'll give you more details. But I want to talk about her mother just a minute, Selma Shapiro, who started the Children's Museum. And then for many years, up in what's today the Children's Museum, when she only had a portion of that building being used for the museum, she gave me one of the rooms. And I was able to use that room for 16 years to have a Cub Scout pack, Cub Scout Pack 220. And we met year round, used the gym for our regular pack meetings, and then used the rooms for the den meetings. Had a wonderful association up there with Selma. I didn't even have a clue about her connection to Alvin Weinberg at the time. But later I learned about that and actually got to go into those archives before they were digitized and look at some of them. Um, it's amazing what's in there. So that's what we've got Ronnie on today for, is to give us some insight into the Alvin Weinberg Papers project. So Ronnie, we're glad to have you here. And if it's all right, you can tell us anything in addition to what I just said about your involvement with the project.
Thanks, Ray. I appreciate that. Yes, I had not planned this as part of my retirement. But it has played out in a way that has been extremely meaningful to me. I had been on the board of the Children's Museum after my mom passed away. And when I came off the board to the advisory board, Beth, the director, approached me and said, how would you like to have a project? And how would you like to digitize Alvin Weinberg's collection? And that just immediately resonated with me because I knew how much it meant to my mom. And my background in working at Y12 was in working with large databases and large paper collections. I worked in radiation protection and dosimetry, but also records. So, I went into it a little bit blind, like, sure, I can do this. No problem. That was back in 2017. And it has been a wonderful project working with really special people, including you, Ray. Just really have enjoyed this better than any project that I have ever had.
Well, it's one of my favorite projects too. And let's begin by telling our readers or our watchers, if you will. I'm so accustomed to writing historically speaking, Keith, I talk about readers.
Mm-hmm.
But at any rate, we've got folks who'll be watching this, and some of them might not even know who Alvin Weinberg is. It's amazing how our young people, especially, but even some of our old folks, know so little about Oak Ridge, but so little about the history and especially about the key individuals. So let's start by you telling us who is Alvin Weinberg.
Yes, and as a native Oak Ridger, I also forget this, that there are, especially in the younger generation, people who have never heard of Alvin. And so really part of the attraction of this project is reintroducing him to a new generation, because the legacy that he has left really is something that people of any age can gain something from. So I was just asked the other day when I was at the museum, I was working in the archives, and a younger person said, well, who is Alvin Weinberg? And for just 1 second, my jaw kind of dropped, and I was like, oh, well, let me tell you about him. So I think, the first thing most people would say is that he was a Manhattan Project scientist. We had very, very famous people, and he was certainly mentored by Vigner, and then spent his entire life after he came to Oak Ridge in this community, which makes him particularly important. But obviously, he was the director at Ornell from a very young age, from 1955 until 1973. And one of the things that made him such an incredible director is that he was faced right after the war with trying to make sure that ORNL had a mission. Because there was a lot of efforts, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to move the work out of Oak Ridge, reactor work, to Chicago. He worked really hard to make sure that that didn't happen. He got Ornell, made sure they were involved with radioisotopes, which was an area that he found to be really important. So he was just this hugely impactful director, and left Ornell, when he did leave, really a place that was a leader in science and research, and that's true even today. But what some people also don't realize, he's not just important to Oak Ridge, he was important really worldwide. Not only was he accomplished and had so many awards, he was concerned with issues that have to do with people's lives, whether it was making sure that countries had a source of energy. He knew back in the 70s that energy was going to be a huge issue, and of course believed that nuclear energy was one of the ways to address it. But he also was interested in things like overpopulation, societal issues that he felt technology could really play a role in helping.
Yeah, I want to add one thought to what you said about him. He was asked what's the most important thing Oak Ridge has ever done for the world. And without any hesitation, he said medical isotopes helps millions of people every year. And of course, the exact same science, the exact same equipment that separated the uranium for Little Boy, first atomic bomb ever used in warfare, also separated those stable isotopes that were taken over to the graphite reactor and made radioactive and turned into nuclear medicine, starting as early as 1946. So almost immediately after the war, Oak Ridge turned to peacetime activities that has benefited the world enormously. Nuclear medicine is something that almost everyone has had an experience with, or at least knows somebody who's had a technetium scan of their heart, or some such efforts involving nuclear medicine. So Oak Ridge and Alvin Weinberg has had an impact worldwide, even more than we realize. And you're right, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, while the effort is credited to William Pollard and a group of professors from UT, Alvin was right in the middle of all of that, and of getting the laboratory designated as a national lab, when all it had at that time was the graphite reactor. Now, of course, since it's become the largest laboratory in the Department of Energy Systems, with enormous experiments and scientific achievements over the years. Not to mention the fact that even today, Frontier is the fastest, most powerful supercomputer in the world. So coming back to Alvin Weinberg, tell us about the project. What is this Papers project that you're working on?
Yeah, so the collection that he left, the Children's Museum, is incredibly large. It was 17 file cabinets and 30 large boxes. And it had been nicely taken care of for many years. He donated it in 1986, but had never been digitized, and really needed an archivist to go through it again and make sure that we had an inventory of everything that was in there. So we hired an archivist, a young woman who was a recent graduate of the University of Tennessee from their program. And she began the process for us. And so not only we were preserving by taking everything out of the cabinets and putting them in boxes where they could stay long term, we were also inventorying it and creating a finding aid, which is actually electronic, and as I'll show later, is on the database. But when we got to the digitization part, that was probably the most exciting. Everything took a whole lot longer than we thought. Including the pandemic decided to slow us down a little bit. Just trying to find people that were willing to work to digitize the papers. But one of the goals we had in mind in making sure we preserve this collection it was so unique that a laboratory director would have kept this large historical collection, and he knew early on it was historical. It's a collection that tells stories about Oak Ridge and the world. I find that every time I go into the collection. When we decided to keep it in the order essentially that he had it, and that was sort of I felt a critical decision, and to me it's what makes the archive seem even more real as you go through it. But we have completed all the archival work. Everything's in boxes. We've completed all the digitizing, and now we're moving to phase 3, which is to start with a very small exhibit, and then from there go to a very large exhibit featuring Weinberg, making sure it's a STEM exhibit for the youth, but also having the archive accessible and things that adults will enjoy, since that's the nature of the museum, is to have things both for the parents and the kids and make it together a learning experience.
Now, speaking of the museum, doesn't it seem a little odd that a children's museum would have a large collection of scientific papers? How did that come to be?
And I'm sure that is a question that gets asked frequently. And much of that, the vision in the museum's direction came from my mother. And part of that was about because she saw us growing up in Oak Ridge with this wonderful life. It was an incredibly good childhood. And then we were clueless. We didn't really know what our parents did. My father worked on the Manhattan Project and stayed as a chemical engineer for his entire career in Oak Ridge. But she felt it was really important that we understand there was a community here before Oak Ridge was here, why Oak Ridge was created, what some of the difficult decisions were, get those pictures out there for people to see. And she made that a part of the museum because her philosophy was children and adults should be able to learn side by side. And they'll do it in different ways, but that should be, and she was the first person in the community to do that. We obviously had a wonderful science museum, but it wasn't telling the cultural side and the history side so much. And so there was plenty of room for her to do that. But in terms of how Alvin picked the museum to give his papers to was really a fascinating intersection with my family and with Alvin and the history of Oak Ridge. So I don't know if people remember Awareness House. This is something that Alvin was very interested in. They had them in several places across the country because there was a drug epidemic at that time. This is around 1970. I was actually in high school at that time, so I remember Awareness House really well. And as it turned out, my dad was the head of United Way. And we just the other day, when we were in the collection, found the submission of requests for money from Alvin Weinberg to my dad, addressed to my dad, explaining what they needed the money for Awareness House. And so my dad was involved with this Awareness House. Alvin was involved with it. The Girl Scouts were involved with it. And my mother was involved because she was heavily involved in scouting. And so when Awareness House didn't work, the Girl Scouts then turned their attention to creating a small museum, which was over in the old Jefferson Junior High School. And from that blossomed the Children's Museum with my mother as the director. And so she and Alvin developed a close relationship. And when he saw the way she was presenting information about history, he wanted his collection to go there. So he set up an MOU so that the museum would have his papers in perpetuity. And I know, so I'm glad to be able to tell that story because a lot of people do scratch their heads and say, why is this here? And why is this museum like it is? And I think it's unique, just like Oak Ridge is unique.
Yeah, and I agree that relationship between your mom and Alvin was a special one and did result in a great collection. And why is that archive so important?
I think for one thing, it's a way to preserve Alvin's legacy. And I believe that his legacy is incredibly important. And when people leave, you want them to leave behind something besides just their memories. In the case of my mother, her legacy is a physical and structure. It's the Children's Museum, and that's a legacy that I support. And what Alvin left behind is this incredible set of papers that not only tell who he is as a human being, it tells the history our community and the larger community and the world. So I think that this particular set of papers should last in perpetuity, because it should be there to teach subsequent generations about not just history, but how to live a good life. That's, to me, something that he left, is he wasn't just a brilliant scientist. He just cared so much about people. Whether you were a nobody or you were a somebody, he treated you exactly the same and made it important. So I think he's a hometown hero, and I'm really proud to support his legacy.
I think you're right, exactly. And how far along are you in the project now?
Yeah, I'm so happy to say that the biggest part of the work is behind us, because everything has been archived and digitized. And while we're focused on some cleanup efforts, and also a little bit more, we're looking at digitizing some slides that we hadn't gotten to yet. We're focusing now on how to utilize this great archive, how to index it, maybe in a way that can work better, how to have maybe some programming around it, but also about getting the exhibits in play.
So you have some left to do. You're not completely finished yet, but you're a large part finished, right?
Yes, we are a large part finished. And it's funny because I say that this is going to be a lifetime project for me. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get to the point where I can say that the project is really finished, but we've had our public opening. That was a really great night that we had on Zoom in honor of Alvin's birth anniversary a couple of years ago. We have myself and a couple of others are managing the database. So there should never be a reason for people to go into the archive. That's something that you really want to curtail, because anytime somebody goes into those boxes, they can move things around or not have things come back exactly right. So the fact that everyone can go, whether they're a regular person or scientists, can go to the digital database.
You know, Ronnie, it's funny you should say that, because in the filmmaking world, we have a saying that says, you never finish, you just run out of time.
I think
Because you can
exactly right.
you're always tweaking things and changing things until you can't anymore. So I understand that.
And speaking of filmmaking, Keith, you made a documentary film on Alvin Weinberg's life. As a matter of fact, we need to think about that. And I'm just talking off the top of my head now, but that needs to be a part of the archive. We need to get that to her in the form where it could be selected part of the archive. 7-minute or 30-minute documentary?
It's an hour.
Yes.
Isn't it, Keith?
Mm-hmm.
It's an hour? Okay.
No.
But at any rate, we need to get that in the archive. So you need to figure out how to do that, okay?
Yes, and in fact, we were, I guess, friends of Ornell, who were one of our big supporters in the beginning. They gave us the ability to utilize that information, that particular documentary, which is wonderful. And we're trying to figure out maybe how to integrate that possibly into the exhibit. Is that, do we want clips playing or have it playing, and how to preserve it? And we haven't quite.
So you already have that capability. Then could I go to the archives and find that film and watch it?
Well, right now it's just we just have the DVD, so we haven't posted it to the database yet.
Well, once you figure out how you need that, Ronnie, if you need clips or whatever, I can source the original material and go to the original source, and it will be better than pulling something off of a DVD. So
that sounds wonderful. That would be great.
I've still got the original files, and I can cut it up and chop it up and give it to you however you need it. So, and process it appropriately for online streaming. So just let me know.
There you go. Hey,
I think that would be great. And the one thing we do have on our website about Weinberg are the interviews that were done by Dick Smizer, the editor of the Oak Ridger. If you've seen those, there are 3 interviews done in Alvin's home, and there's some of the few available with him speaking, and they are on our website. So I think having this other movie that you guys did, which was wonderful, along with that would be extremely valuable.
I've also got an interview. It's not very long. It's about 25 minutes that I did with Alvin when I first started making the Secret City movie, the very first Secret City movie. So I've got that somewhere. But it's about, yeah, I went to his house and he was pretty, he
That's
was,
an addition.
I don't think he lived very long after that, maybe a couple of years. So it's pretty much near the end of his life. So
That would have been around 2005. You published the movie in 2006.
yeah,
So it would have been
this would have been
4.
probably around 2003 when I shot the interview, 2003 or 2004. So anyway, that's
Good deal. Yeah. We got some additions for you there, Ronnie, that I think will be good. Speaking of looking into the archives, do you have some things that you could show us that some of the content that's in there that we could actually look at?
Yeah, so it's so hard to pick things, and I have picked some for today. I also have a Facebook page, the Weinberg Facebook page, where I periodically post to things that I think would be of interest to people, so people can also go there. But I was looking for things that are of particular importance to me just recently, and I focused on Oppenheimer, since there's going to be that documentary. So I wanted to first start with a few things, and you can stop me if I'm taking too long. I'm gonna try to share to the screen just a couple things and maybe read out loud from them, so that we're not going to use the entirety of everything. So I'm going to try to share, and you tell me. Go ahead. All right, and you tell me if I'm getting the right box. Let's start with this really simple one. Okay, is that showing on your screen?
Yep.
Yeah, we see January 6, 1948 to Dr. Oppenheimer.
Yes, and this is one of several pages long, and it's not that I'm going to read the whole thing, but I thought this was so fascinating because Oppenheimer at the time was on a advisory committee to the AEC, and this is when they're trying to save ORNL. And so he writes like a 5-page paper talking to Oppenheimer about what he sees as the issues. And I'm not sure how this is appearing on your screen, if it's big enough for people to read the words. I just wanted to read a few of the words that come across. And in this particular one, he addresses him formally, "Dear Dr. Oppenheimer." And you'll see a difference between this and another communication I'll show in a minute. But he sets out very logically to explain why he's opposed to this decision that AEC is about to make to move all the reactor work to Chicago. And he tells them there's 3 problems with it. And that the first one is that, concentrating all the reactor work in one place is not something he necessarily takes issue with, but he wants to say that nothing has been mentioned about moving Brookhaven reactor work to Chicago or Schenectady work to Chicago, and he thinks that there's an inconsistency there. And he says, secondly, is the fantastically inept manner in which the decision was carried out, a manner which appeared to us to be that of panicking men. On this, there seems to be very general agreement. As Mr. Pike said to us in Washington, quote, "This is a hell of a way to run a railroad," end quote. That just says so much about his personality and his sense of humor. And then it goes on to explain in very big, in-depth detail about why that this should not take place. And that's something that I'll load to the featured selection area at some point, and people will be able to see the full article. So that gives you one sense of his communication with Oppenheimer. And then I'll show you something that contrasts that. That's very simple. And I think I could do a new share, and that takes me back. And let's see if I can pick up the right one from 1963. Let's see, is this box 2?
Now you're still sharing the original letter, so you'll have to unshare.
Okay, and let's see if it will let me. It's interesting that it doesn't want to take me to the one that I want, which I'm not. Let me see if this will do it. See, let me see what comes up when I do this.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see this?
We
Yes.
do.
So
The
here is in April of 1963. And this time when he writes to Oppenheimer, you can see it addressed as Dear Oppie, a much more representing a much more creative, I mean, you know, closer relationship. And in this one, he's saying, I think I speak for all your many friends at Oak Ridge, saying how pleased we are about your winning the Fermi Award, which is a really big deal that he got approved finally to, Oppenheimer got approved to win the Fermi Award. And, you know, he's saying, we're all delighted that the commission has finally come around to taking General Grove's advice seriously and with such happy effect. Congratulations, and please enjoy the $50 times 10 to the third, which I loved. And I just recently posted this to the Facebook page. And what this did, and this happens so often, is it made me think, because I was addressing the post by saying his award was signed by President Kennedy. And then I realized that in 1963 that Kennedy was killed. And so that caused me to step back and research for just a minute extra and realize that, yes, Kennedy did sign it, but it was actually Johnson that had to present it to him in December of that year because of the fact that Kennedy had been killed. And so I was able to even include a quote that Johnson made about how he felt about having to stand in for Kennedy with this. And that's what I find so often in this collection, is that I find something and then it has me then going down another trail to learn a little bit more.
I understand that. It's easily to get caught into new rabbit trails.
I was going to make one more quick thing about Oppenheimer, and then I'll move to the next person. And you can stop me and tell me when I need to
You're doing fine.
Go a bit faster. One of the other things that I tend to find in the archive is that he saved a lot of articles that were meaningful from periodicals. And this is when Oppenheimer died in 1967. And he was involved with the National Academy of Sciences. And so somebody wrote and I just want to read a few sentences out of this. After Oppenheimer died, there's a tribute to him, but it contains information that I wasn't aware of. So it tells me that J. Robert Oppenheimer died of throat cancer in Princeton, New Jersey on February 18th. I just had not known that he had died of throat cancer. And talks about his extraordinary contributions as a theoretical physicist, an educator, an administrator, and that these have already been utilized. So he then, as you go a little bit farther along, has this quote that apparently Oppenheimer gave at his last public appearance of this National Academy of Science observance in 1963. And he says, "We know, all of us, that the experience of scientific discovery is a good and beautiful experience and an unforgettable one. We know this is true even of little discoveries. And we understand that with the great ones, it is shattering." And I just love being able to hear Oppenheimer's words. And that's what I find so much in the collection, is that the words of the people that are no longer here come right back to us in a voice that allows us to hear them.
I agree that the authenticity of what you're reading in these source documents really is amazing.
It really is. So I was going to do it. Do I have time for? I have one about Seaboard.
Sure.
You tell me when to stop, and I won't do this anymore.
I want you to actually show them the database too, but let's go ahead with this one.
Oops, this was actually Rickover.
Rickover, yeah. Of course,
I'll mention Rickover. So one of the other things that's in the database is a lot of speeches that people gave, and this one happened to be by Admiral Rickover, and I think it's relatively fairly well known. This was back in 1956, where he's talking about the education of our children. And I just thought a couple of the sentences that he made was sort of hitting home. And he said, this is Rickover speaking, I'm going to address one specific aspect of our failure to identify and develop our talented youth and the loss to the nation which results from the waste of this most precious natural asset. And farther down, it says, if we do not realize that the education of our children is our most important task, if we're more concerned with their clothes or their recreation or entertainment than training their minds, then we need not be surprised that our schools do not produce either an adequately educated citizenry or a sufficiently large and competent corps of professional men and women to maintain our culture and civilization. I was like,
Wow.
yeah, yeah, that's true today.
We see it being lived out today.
Absolutely. And if I have time, and I may not even pull it up, I may just read you a couple words from Seaborg, because what he said was so incredibly important. Let me see if this is it. If it's not, I'm just going to read it anyway, because it's hard for you to see. No, this is not it. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, but I just want to read a few words. This was Seaborg addressing the Associated Press Editors Convention in 1970. And he starts out talking about how this is the farthest he's ever had to travel to give a speech, and how important it was. It was so important that he wanted to speak to them that he was willing to do it. But these words just really resonated with me. He said, and then remember, this is 1970. He said, never in history has the power or the importance of the press been greater. Never have its responsibilities been greater, and never has its job been more difficult. A good and conscientious journalist faces an incredible task today. He's operating in a world of increasingly rapid change, flooded with torrents of events generated by a growing number of activists. That's sort of funny. He is confronted by new complexity created by a scientific technological culture that speaks a new language he must learn more of every day. He's challenged to be objective and subjective, factual and fascinating, respectful and provocative, patriotic and apolitical, all at once and at the same time. And just to add to the last sentence, he's asked to capture public attention in a society saturated with information and entertainment from competing media that is often stimulated by them to the point of either frenzy or stupor. So what's happening today was happening back in 1970, and I just didn't remember.
Oh, I think you need to pull that out and post that on your Facebook page. And then at the end, say, you think this was written about today?
I know.
And we haven't learned. We're still missing the mark.
Yes.
Well, listen, take just a minute and show us the actual database. And if you can, go ahead and show us what it looks like. And if you can do a simple search just to pull something up, I think that would help the people to be able to see what you're talking about when you talk about a digitized database. So if it's not too much trouble, try that.
All right, can you see this?
Yeah, we got a picture of Alvin there and the Children's Museum. So that's the first page they'll find when they go to the Children's Museum and select the Weinberg Papers, correct?
Yes, the easiest way to get to this page is to go to the Children's Museum of Oak-Ridge.org, pick Weinberg page, and then there's a big red button you can do. Now, once you go to it, you can save that. And you don't have to go through that so many times. But so here we are at the archive. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes, and you'll be able to see on this page that there's lots of different ways you can search. And so just to tell you a little bit about that, and then I'll show you one or two of them. You can search by putting, you see up in this top area, one thing says search. So you can go down here and search the archives just by using a word. And know that if you just use a word, you're probably going to get a whole lot of answers. And that may not be very helpful to you. So something else you can do is search for a phrase. So you can put a string of several words together in quotation marks, and that gives you a chance to kind of pare it down a little bit. Those are simple searches, but it is going to bring you back a ton of information, which I'll explain in a minute, will be harder for you to sort through. Another thing you can do is browse subjects. So one of the things that the archivists did when they were processing the papers is that they indexed them a lot of times with subjects. And you can see this is all alphabetical. And in the very first list of, say, 10 of them, you can see all these different choices for subjects. And then you could select one of those. And let's say I just pick aeronautics, and it's going to tell you I find these 5 records. And then you would click on these. So that's a way to do things. And in this case, it only found 5, which is good. But sometimes you can get like 100. So you need to know ways to what to do when you get too many. And one thing you'll see on the left-hand side of the date is that they're also, these papers are indexed by dates. And so like if I look at these and I only want to see the ones from 1947 to 1948, I can click there, and then it brought it down to 1 record. So that's just, these are just little things that one thing I'm thinking about doing is creating a video. And I know, Ray, you guys did a nice short video to show people how to search. And I'm thinking about doing one that's just a little bit more involved that people could pull up and learn some of these things that they can do to make the searching easier.
Anything you do visually like that to help people will be good. So I encourage you.
So that's how to use the subjects, but I also have something that I created that I really like called featured collections. And I know, Ray, you kind of showed this once before, but I want to mention it again. This is for people that really do not have a background in science or know Weinberg enough to know what to search on. They don't know what word or what subject. And so I've gone ahead and pulled out either like 1 page to 3 page, essentially, pieces of files and named them things that might be of interest to people. And in that case, you just click on one and something that looks like, oh, decision to stay in 1945. And then it immediately pulls up the file and you open it. Now, I think when I open it, it's not going to show you on the screen. Or does it? Does it show you on the screen when I open?
I think it's opened in another tab.
Yeah,
So
and that's okay, because people don't have to see this. But just to let you know that anytime your file comes up, and in this case, decision to stay, you have to open the file, because as I mentioned, everything in this database is based on a box with files. And so the smallest thing you can go to is a file. And that's one thing I need to educate people about is, what if you open a file, like these are all short, so there's nothing to search on. You just read the 1 or 2 or 3 pages associated with it and can appreciate it. But if you're doing a different kind of search and you open a file, and it could have 400 pages in it. And in that case, you'd want to be looking for something more specific. So say when I was talking to Ray about finding information about Oppenheimer, and it brought up 180 files. I opened each one of those 180 files, but I searched in them. Once I opened the file, I typed in search for Oppenheimer, and then it was able to take me directly to the part of the file that had something about Oppenheimer in it. So there are ways to make it easier.
You're able to search within the file.
Yes, that's the most important thing for people to know, is you can search within the file. You don't have to go through page by page. Obviously, if you're retired and you don't have that much to do, going through it page by page is really fun. But most people would probably not have the patience to do that. So you definitely can search within the file. And one other thing I'll mention about the database is I said that we had this finding aid, which is an inventory of everything that's in the database. And let's see if it will come up. And what's beautiful about this is that we added links to it. So not only do we have the box number and the file number and a very short description that the archive has created, we can take you directly there so that you don't have to come out of the finding aid and go back into the database. So this can be useful. And I think I was working with Carolyn on one of the searches we were doing for Seaborg, and it turned out that when I came to this finding aid, I just searched on Seaborg, and there were several files dedicated to him, and that made it a whole lot faster and easier to gather information. So there's I guess what I want to emphasize is there's just 5 or 6 different ways you can search. And if one of those, if one doesn't work, try another. And I'm also very interested in getting feedback. So anybody that wants to send an email, I think you can. There's an email feature in this. I think it may be make a request. You can send an email and say, hey, I was in the archive and I couldn't find out what I was looking for. Can you help me? And then we can reach out and help people. I love this database. I mean, I am looking forward to working on it for a very long time. I'm hoping to find other ways to help index so that people can search faster and easier. But every time I am in this database, I find something that I really appreciate.
Are all the documents PDFs?
Yes, thank you for asking. Yes, that is the format, is PDFs.
Okay.
Good.
Good.
So that
All
means they can, once they have the document up, they can search for the particular things of interest and also can either save that document or print that document, can do whatever they would like to do with it.
Yes, one feature I use is usually you don't want to print, if it's a very large file of 400 pages, you're not going to want to print that file. But what if there's just 2 or 3 pages you want? One of the great features of PDFs is you can print to PDF and just print the pages of interest and then have them on your computer.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, excellent. This has been a really good review. But before we finish up here, you mentioned your Facebook page and you also mentioned an exhibit that you're going to have in the museum. Give us just a little more information about those 2 aspects of your involvement with the archive.
Yeah, so I guess the 3 different ways to get information, you can come directly to the archive itself. I would love if people would come to the Facebook page. I think it's a great way to bring in a lot of people that might not otherwise know about it, and you're able to see the things that I'm posting, and so that's easy to find. But now we're obviously moving towards the exhibits, and I know that it's not announced yet, but I know we have sort of selected a company, and we're first working on what we're calling the Weinberg Corner, which is in the Discovery Room. It's the room with the giant picture of Einstein. And so we'll probably have a giant picture of Weinberg. And we'll start there with something small this year. Because this is the 50th anniversary of the Children's Museum, my goal is to have that Weinberg Corner completed this year so it can be part of the celebration. And we're looking at what kinds of things can we put in a small space, both for adults and children. But what will be, and as soon as that's done, then we'll move on to, we already have the room selected where we're going to have the very large exhibit. And we'll have to get a grant for that, but it's going to be a STEM exhibit. And I think there's some good funds for a STEM exhibit that in the museum, almost everything is interactive. So that's the kind of exhibit we want. We want kids to be climbing on reactors or whatever else we want to teach them about, radioisotopes or critical thinking. It's so important for kids today. And also we want to emphasize the personal side of Weinberg, that living a full life also involves not just science, but he was a tennis player. He played the piano. He had relationships with all kinds of people. And we want to teach that to our kids, that you don't have to be on your phone all day, that being with people and sharing ideas is really important.
Well, good. I'm looking forward to those 2 activities at the Children's Museum, but I am so proud of what has been accomplished to put this digitized archive, a fabulous archive, online, and it is available. Go to the Facebook page to learn about things that are happening as we speak, but also know that there's a number of ways to find information in the Alvin Weinberg Papers project. That Ronnie, you've done a wonderful job leading this project, and I think it is an excellent retirement opportunity for you. to keep you busy and out of trouble. So thank you for coming today and sharing with us again the status of the Weinberg Papers.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys for having me. I really, really enjoyed it.
All right, very good. All right, Ray, who do we have lined up for our next time?
Well, next time we're going to have Heather McClanahan from Los Alamos. She was the director of the Los Alamos County Museum for a number of years. She's retired, but as you know, the movie that is coming out in July, I believe, July the 21st of 2023, Christopher Nolan is producing a movie on Oppenheimer.
Mhm.
And what Ronnie was talking about, the NBC Studios is producing what I believe is going to be a 2-hour documentary on on Oppenheimer. That'll be running on the Peacock, their streaming channel. And we've been contacted by them. Of course, Oppenheimer wasn't in Oak Ridge much, so there's not going to be much included in the documentary nor in the movie that'll make a connection to Oak Ridge, I'm sure. But we did send the NBC Studios access to, actually, Ronnie pulled out several of the Oppenheimer documents and we sent those to them. So they're looking through that to see if they can use them. But Heather is working on the Oppenheimer exhibit at Los Alamos for the Oppenheimer house that's there on Bathtub Road. And she's heavy into that research now. And she and I have maintained contact over the years. And I just asked her if she'd come on and tell us about what she's doing in getting ready for the Oppenheimer exhibit in the Oppenheimer house there in Los Alamos. So Heather will be our next guest in a couple of weeks. Okay.
That sounds great. And all right, Ronnie, again, thank you so much for being with us today. And folks, we appreciate you watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.